This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Now you're probably sitting there wondering, what, no Rampage review? Well, you'd be correct. And if you would like an explanation, I'd be more than happy to provide one. And my answer is simple. Are people even watching Rampage at this point? Aside from the pitiable 400,000 saps that have nothing else going on Friday nights, that they actually put aside an hour of their time to watch a completely meaningless wrestling program with all of AEW's D-level talent? Well, I guess those people still exist. Now, to give you the brief recap from last week's show, as we were wrapping up the Rampage report, I had sort of an impromptu epiphany where I realized that the show is a complete waste of time, energy, and money. And because there is never anything remotely interesting to talk about coming out of it, I figure I'd be better off finding something else to talk about instead, because even if the modern wrestling ain't giving me a whole lot to enjoy these days, at least I know there's plenty of classic content to make up for it. So I guess now would be the point where I inform the new and returning viewers to the Five Starr Wrestling Report that we are done with AEW Rampage. At least for the foreseeable future. Unless there's a Punk match or an MJF match or a Bryan Danielson match, I've about tapped out with that entire program. I've come to the realization that Rampage is essentially the AEW Dynamite Leftovers program where all of the lesser important talent are featured because they can't make time to get them on the Dynamite show on Wednesday because they got too much shit going on. And if there's one thing that I really don't need to see more of after Wednesday night's constant delivery of bad indie wrestling, it's more bad indie wrestling. So we've delved into a new segment for the FSWR show. We're going to be talking about Retro Raw. Specifically, we're going to be jumping back into the time machine to be talking exclusively about WWF's Raw library, dating all the way back to 1993 and working our way through the shows from July of 93 onward. So I guess you could say this is an extension of the regular Friday Retro Review series, only now we'll be diving into more WWF/WWE content, which this podcast is lacking greatly. The modern WWE product is mostly garbage as it is, but I do feel like there's a pretty big gaping hole on this channel with not talking more about WWF's history, especially because I still grew up watching it and I do have fond memories of the WWF from the 90s, some good, some bad, but I thought it'd be nice to share some of that history. And in addition to talking about Raw, we will be continuing with the NWA Powerrr reports that in whatever weekend pay-per-view events are happening from the major companies. And we'll still talk Dynamite each week on the Friday show, so if you're a fan of hearing me talk about how god-awful that television program is most weeks, you can stop by each Friday and hear what I have to say about it. It's certainly missing quality talent, that's for damn sure. But for now, let's get going with the Monday show. And what better way to open things up by diving right into the Retro Raw report. Specifically, today, we will be looking at the July 5th, 1993 edition. Well then, where to start? Well, I guess we should start with my personal experience growing up watching Raw. While I can't say I have a lot of vivid memories of pro wrestling from an early childhood, One thing I do remember is getting the opportunity to see the very first pilot episode of Monday Night Raw from the Grand Ballroom of the Manhattan Center on January 11th, 1993. I still remember that date like the back of my hand. And, aside from the NWA tapes that my brothers recorded from the TBS Superstation, WWF Raw had some of my earliest memories of actually being able to see wrestling on a televised capacity. Let's see, I was born in 87, so I guess I would have been 6 when the first episode of Raw took place. Still crazy, man. To think that this has been a flagship show for professional wrestling for damn near 30 years now. And granted, Raw has gone through a lot of different stages throughout history, whether it's switching to various networks like Spike TV and bouncing back to the USA Network, going from an hour to 2 hours. God help the poor saps that are watching now. It's 3 hours. And there's still people out there that watch all 3 hours of this show every single week. My God. Bless them. That's all I can say. But, here we are in 2022, and Raw is still going strong. And yes, it's definitely a shell of what it used to be, even dating back as recently as the late 2000s when viewership was still well above 2 million viewers on a consistent week-to-week basis. But, being a part of that history of getting to experience the pilot episode of Raw and seeing the ups and downs and modifications the show's gone through over the last 30 years, it's been a very interesting ride. Now, if you watch the podcast weekly, you would know that I have not watched Monday Night Raw in quite a while. Honestly, I can't remember off the top of my head. The last episode of Raw I watched, God, what are we, going back 7 or 8 years by now? Whenever WWE was doing the whole authority angle and they were forcing Roman Reigns down everyone's throat as a babyface, that was probably the last time I actually watched Raw consistently every single week. It's not to say that the authority or the Roman Reigns force was the turning point for me, because I'd been down on the WWE product as a whole, even dating back as far as post-Attitude Era. For me, once the whole Steve Austin heel turn went down and they shot that garbage-ass angle at WrestleMania 17 with him hugging Vince and followed that with that horribly botched invasion angle, that was honestly the point in my life where I just really soured on this product. And that happened in what? That was 2001, right? Yeah, I think that's when that all went down. And that was obviously coming off the heels of WCW going out of business, so man, that entire year was just a huge blot on the wrestling business as a whole. And it astounds me to this day that there are still fucking morons out there that defend the invasion angle and the Steve Austin Vince McMahon alignment. I mean, I could have told you that shit made no sense when I was, 14 or 15 at the time? Yeah, but now we're kind of going on a tangent about the timeline of WWE. Now, what we're here to do is talk about Raw, again from July 5th, 1993, as we kickstart the second part of the weekly retro review series. Once again, on Fridays, you will get the NWA World Championship Wrestling on the Superstation and World Class Championship Wrestling from the Dallas Sportatorium. And on Mondays, we'll be including WWF Raw, once again beginning from July of 93 and working our way forward. The goal is to make sure that we're in close proximity to the current date in history, so that's why we're starting in July and not going all the way back to January. This will be the AEW Rampage replacement, and I can already guarantee that after rewatching one episode of the cartoon era of the World Wrestling Federation, we're already going to have more fun things to pick apart than talking about AEW's D-list roster. So hopefully you'll stick around for the ride. Enjoy the content going forward, and if you are somebody that likes going back to relive old WWF footage, the Monday show will be the one to watch going forward. So without further ado, let's get going with things. This is WWF Monday Night Raw from the Manhattan Center in Poughkeepsie, New York. I still don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's my best guess. And our show begins with Aaron Copland, the most overrated American composer of our lifetime that I had the great displeasure of having to study in undergrad. And if you're a musician, you understand what I'm talking about. No, actually, our program begins with some very brief footage of the U.S.S. Intrepid from the previous afternoon, as the WWF hosted the Stars and Stripes Challenge, and it was all centered around the Yokozuna Body Slam Challenge, figuring out who was capable of slamming the near 600-pound Samoan, who was billed from Japan and that we were all supposed to buy was actually of Japanese descent. Well, we would find out momentarily, but first, we cut to the Manhattan Center where we are joined by our three-man commentary booth of Vince McMahon, Bobby the Brain Heenan, and the Macho Man. Ooh, yeah! And let me say this. You've heard me complain before about how much I despise the three-man commentary booth. But here is a rare example in wrestling history where the three-man commentary team actually worked. Now, granted, that was mostly due to the talent of the individuals and the fact that they were three distinct personalities with their own unique qualities. You had the straight shooter play-by-play guy in Vince. You had the witty weasel heel color commentator in Bobby the Brain. And you had the mega personality babyface color guy in Randy Savage, who always did a phenomenal job working the role of splitting between commentator and wrestler. Because it is important to remember that he was still an active worker by this period. A lot of it was sporadic until, I believe, the end of 94. Because that's when he left for WCW, right? But God, what a phenomenal team this was. You know, all three guys had great chemistry with each other. They all played off one another well. And, you know, these guys brought life and energy to the show that is almost unheard of in the business today. But they take us to the clips of the Intrepid. And this is pretty much what the entire show was built around. Once again, the Yokozuna Body Slam Challenge. And they go through the highlights of showing all the various celebrities who failed to slam Yoko, including a former Pittsburgh Penguins player who went well over my head because I've never watched sports. There was some guy that apparently played for the New York Giants that I believe was in there. We had various wrestlers try and fail, such as Bob Backlund, Big Papa Pump Scott Steiner. And while Steiner was definitely jacked to the gills here, he was not quite at Freakzilla level like we would see in the latter years of WCW before he really hit the gas. I believe we also had Tatanka and the Macho Man fail to get the job done here. And just when we thought that all the challengers were through, there was one man that Mr. Fuji and Yoko left out of the equation. God, I remember this like it was yesterday too because it was so ridiculous. Who could ever forget the completely out-of-the-blue babyface turn for Lex Luger, who, if you all remember your WWF history, had debuted earlier in the year as a heel under the moniker of The Narcissist. And he would come out on the show every week carrying a mirror reflecting on how great his body looked. Because again, if you all remember, this was right around the point where he was doing the whole bodybuilding thing right after leaving WCW in his first run. And Vince took one look at the guy and said, "Yep, I'll take him." So, yes. He showed up as a heel in early 93, and by the summer of the same year, with absolutely no build-up, rhyme, or reason, Vince McMahon woke up one day and said, "Oh, God damn it, pal, we need a new Hulk Hogan. We need a new American hero. I've got it, the Lex Express." And so began the infamous montage of Lex Luger traveling the country in a touring bus, trying his damnedest to be the most white meat of white meat baby faces, and boy did it go over like a fart in church. Yeah, looking back, I feel so bad for Lex, because man, he tried. He really tried to get this gimmick over, but I think once people caught on to the fact that he was just being forced over as a Hulk Hogan knockoff, you know, even the WWF fans back in the early 90s could see through that bullshit. But they did the deal here. Lex went in there, cut a moderately decent babyface promo on Fuji and Yoko. It was as pro-America can get. He tossed Fuji out of the ring, and he got the big lunker up for the body slam, and the people popped big for it. And that immediately put us off to the races for the build-up to the SummerSlam showdown of Yokozuna versus Lex Luger for the WWF title. A match that I have absolutely zero memory of, and God forbid we actually decide to tack on the pay-per-view reviews at some point as well. Hopefully I won't ever have to relive the day of seeing it, because I imagine it was no good. But here's what I can say about this whole angle, just to reflect on it with modern eyes, because it's been a while since I've seen this. Would this work in 2022? Absolutely not. But regardless of what you thought about the whole Lex Express garbage, they put this thing over like it was the biggest deal to happen in the business. And like I said, the people went crazy for Lex here, totally ignoring the fact that the guy was a heel like less than 3 weeks prior to showing up here in a helicopter, decked out in the American garb. But, it is also important to remember Vince's booking philosophy. And ask the wrestling historians. They'll tell you the same thing I'm about to tell you now when it comes to Vince turning characters. Vince was not a detail analyst. Whether or not flip-flopping guys face or heel made sense to do, if Vince wanted to do it, he was going to do it. Logic be damned. Even in 22, we see this same thing playing out on television. Nothing has changed. Vince still operates under the same mentality. If he wakes up one day and decides that he wants to turn a guy or completely change someone's gimmick, even if there's absolutely no rationale behind it, he's going to do it. And I'm sure there were some smart fans that caught on to this at the time, but for the majority of the fan base, even dating back to the early to mid-90s, I think a lot of people look past it because, yay America, basically. Now, keep in mind, too, all because Vince was desperate to find someone to replace Hogan at the top because, he was essentially gone by this point. He spent a little time dabbling in New Japan around 93 before signing with WCW, but by the time we roll around 94, Hogan signed the contract with WCW, and that was the last sighting of Hogan under the WWF banner until, what was it? Late 2001 or early 2002? It's crazy to go back and think that Hulk Hogan was away from the company for that long, but, wrestling was a strange business, and even going back to the mid to late 90s, when there were two major wrestling companies that were actually competing against each other, and not this artificial AEW versus WWE war that all the idiot marks are still trying to sell you on in 2022. So that took us to our first match of the program. It is Blake Beverly of the Beverly Brothers versus the 1-2-3 Kid, which I still place one notch below Six Pack as the worst ring name for Sean Waltman. Not to discredit the actual wrestler Sean Waltman, because he was a great worker, but my God, the 1-2-3 Kid. What a horrible ring name. And I will be the first to admit right here, right now, I have absolutely no memory of the Beverly Brothers in WWF. I remember they wrestled in the AWA for a period of time. Then they wound up in the WWF, and I believe one of them ended up retiring very soon thereafter. So this was, I guess, the brother that wasn't retired. The match itself wasn't anything to write home about, but let's take a minute here to talk about Waltman, because if you were someone that grew up watching wrestling in the 90s on a major stage, Sean Waltman might have probably been one of the first guys that people saw on a mainstream level doing, I think, what a lot of us would call the flashy, high-risk offense. And he was certainly a revolutionary talent, especially for the American audience. There were guys in Japan and even Mexico around this point that were doing very similar style matches to what Waltman was doing, but he was someone that really brought that to the forefront of the American wrestling audience before Bischoff started implementing a lot of the Japanese and Mexican luchador stuff on Nitro in the latter half of the 90s. But, man, the stuff Waltman was able to do is almost incredible for its time, even dating back as far as the 90s. It's hard to imagine that people used to pop big for things like a top rope leg drop, but, unless you were watching Bobby Eaton do similar things in WCW, you really didn't see stuff like this that often. And you can see how influential Waltman was for a lot of the upstarts in the business around this point. We've definitely seen how the boys were able to modify and expand on the flashier ring style over time. Fortunately now, a lot of the boys try the flashy stuff to the point where it just comes off as choreographed and phony looking. Especially with all the bullshit the Beta Bucks do in their goofy video game inspired stunts. But for the time, this was exciting television because you really didn't see it that often. And Waltman, 1-2-3 Kid, X-Pac, whatever you want to call him, he was one of the real pioneers of bringing this style to a mainstream capacity. And that was followed with, oh, God help me, I'd forgotten all about this gimmick. Y'all remember Mom, Men on a Mission? With the good old 500-pound Mabel and Mo and Oscar? And their white as fuck hip-hop music. And the terrible ring gear. Actually, now that I think of it, was there a single redeeming quality about this gimmick? Probably not. I'm trying to remember too, because I know that Mabel ends up becoming King Mabel by 95. But looking back at that trio, I honestly can't remember a whole lot of what they did in that 2-year gap. I think Oscar ended up sort of phasing out of the business entirely once they split. Never really sure entirely what happened to Mo. Obviously Mabel was always Vince's project with that whole group because the guy was massive. Massively immobile, but again, we all know how Vince's mind works, but my God, this whole hype package was just horrendously WWF. Like, these are the kinds of things that when people ask, what made WWF so bad during this period? You just show them a Men on a Mission promo and let it speak for itself. We also had a quick Luna Vachon pre-tape hyping up Bam Bam Bigelow for the upcoming match. God, I miss Luna. She was such a unique character in the business. And the thing that sucks is, she gets talked about from a lot of wrestling historians, and people will name drop her when they're talking about all-time great female talent. But Luna was really special. Most of my memories come from her in the WWF, both her first and her second run. I didn't see any of her stuff in ECW, and whatever brief run she had in WCW in the late 90s, I know it didn't last all that long. I think this was right around the point where she had just shown up, and I remember they were doing a program with her and Sensational Sherry for a period of time. Of course, my obvious latter memories of her come when she's returning as a manager for Goldust by, I guess that would have been 96 or 97. Of course, that's when Russo was booking, so it wasn't entirely memorable for good reasons. But I just wanted to take a minute or two to put over Luna because, if anyone ever gets the impression that I'm anti-women in wrestling based on the way I review the modern era of women's wrestling, it's not true at all. And I've stated this a million times. I personally believe that women absolutely have a place in the wrestling business. And if they're talented enough workers, I have no problem seeing them wrestle. The problem, and I've said this countless times before, the problem is that they're so few and far between anymore, I can pretty much count the number of good female talent in today's business on one hand. And certainly none of them stack up to Sherry or Luna's level. So Bam Bam wrestled a job guy and beat him in about a minute with a splash. Really not a whole lot to note about it beyond that. Always fun going back and watching Bam Bam matches. People always ask, who are among some of the better big men workers in the business? Mostly based on the bad reputation big guys get for not being the most athletically gifted in the ring. Not Bam Bam, man. That guy could move. Seriously. Go watch some of your Bam Bam tapes if you're looking for a real talented big guy. Then we had Samu of the Head Shrinkers going up against the Undertaker. Let me just take a minute to talk about Taker because I believe I've touched on this before, but it's been a while. I think we covered this in the WrestleMania review I did this past year when they inducted Taker into the Hall of Fame class. And I remember I spent a little bit of time talking about how Taker is my favorite wrestler of all time. I was extremely lucky to have gotten to actually see The Undertaker's debut at the 1990 Survivor Series. Now, my actual memories of seeing it in real time are pretty much non-existent because I was, 3 years old at the time. Obviously going back over the years and rewatching the clips of the entrance and everything, it's kind of what brought everything full circle again. But, you want to talk about one of the most truly iconic characters in the wrestling business. See, here's the thing you have to understand about The Undertaker and the whole gimmick. It evidently worked for this time in the business because it was the cartoon era of the WWF where pretty much everyone on the roster was working with some kind of wacky gimmick. And this was a real testament to the skill and ability of a lot of the boys around this time, taking gimmicks and concepts that were given to them and trying to make them work regardless of how inane or stupid they were. And not only was The Undertaker able to take this gimmick and run with it and embrace it, but he got this thing over to such a degree, it still fucking worked 20-odd something years later after the fact when it had no business doing so. And yes, there was obviously the period in the latter half of the Attitude Era where he was doing the whole American badass biker gimmick, and I always thought that kind of killed the mystique in a lot of ways. I understood why they went there for the time period, and it did make sense, but I wouldn't say I was ever the biggest fan of Biker Taker. But to even think that not only was Taker able to modify and alter the gimmick over time, remember he was doing the whole Ministry of Darkness deal and he was sacrificing people on the crucifix, and it was so wacky and so over the top, but god damn it, it fucking worked. And even in the mid-2000s when he came back from the original Deadman gimmick, when he had that Mania match with Kane, there's no reason that should have worked. Especially by that point when the fans were definitely smarter and were more apt to some of the more insider stuff of the business, but I'll be damned. Mark managed to pull it off. And, I guess you could say it's a blessing in disguise that I wasn't smart enough to the business in the early 90s to know that I had already seen The Undertaker working as Mean Mark Callis in WCW, but the other thing you have to remember, he was never a big star there. It flew under the radar by that point. I had seen him in the WWF debut with the Undertaker gimmick. I could talk for hours about Mark. And look, hindsight is 20/20. Everyone's got their demons, and there have been plenty of critics over the years that have talked about The Undertaker playing the political game like all the top guys did in the business. Holding guys back, not putting certain talent over, blah, blah, the whole deal. And I guess if we wanted to scrape and pick through The Undertaker's entire career, we could find plenty of examples of Taker maybe not doing good business. As we could say the same for guys like Hogan, Shawn, Brett, Austin, Cena. God almighty, I could rant on John Cena holding guys back for hours. You want to talk about someone not doing good business? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Captain Fruity Pebble himself. All your favorite top guys, they're all responsible for conducting bad business at one point or another in their careers, especially if they were at the peak of the mountain. If you really want to have that discussion, we can have it separately, but, for all the people out there that are saying Undertaker's a POS because he didn't put this guy over, they're the same people that are Stone Cold Steve Austin defenders and say, oh, that guy always did good business and he always made the right decision. Bullshit. But going back to this, I think back about where The Undertaker started and his ability to evolve and get over in the way he did. You have to understand how special and timeless that is, especially in 2022. When I hear the gong hit and the lights go out and they hit that theme song, I still get fucking goosebumps on that. And there are very few people in the business that are able to capture that, much less being able to do it past their point of relevancy. Taker's essentially been retired as a full-time worker dating back to, the late 2000s, back when his body was starting to break down. But, even in Mania this past year, man, when they hit Taker's music and he came out to the stage to wave to the fans, I still got the goosebumps. And the crazy thing is, I always thought back about that earlier in the year when they were announcing The Undertaker as sort of like the headline for the Hall of Fame class, and I was contemplating back and forth for weeks. I'm like, should he be in kayfabe? Should he not? Should he kind of split the difference a little bit? And I did watch the ceremony, and it was a great speech he gave, and he sort of did kind of break the boundaries a little bit. He wasn't necessarily the dead man, but he wasn't entirely Mark Calaway. And I think it worked for what he was trying to do. And, even seeing him come out of the stage in Mania, he had the hat, but it was more so of Mark Calaway than anything. But, man, the goosebumps are still there. It's hard to describe. For those of you that didn't grow up seeing pretty much the entirety of Taker's career from beginning to end, you'll probably never truly understand what made him so special. A true icon, all-time legend, and that's not an artificial blank statement. And, even the heavy critics of The Undertaker, I think they would have to at least agree with that he deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame and that he really is an icon. It's weird. Hogan never captured my attention in the way Taker did. Austin never captured my attention the way Taker did. Rock never captured my attention the way Undertaker did. And even through all of those megastars, nobody was like The Undertaker. It's crazy. In the business nowadays, you'd be lucky to find somebody with a quarter of the star power that any of these guys had. So I guess we have to talk about this match, right? Well, here's the thing. Something you'll never hear me say is that every Undertaker match was a home run. And it's not often we saw The Undertaker fuck up something royally. Just talked about this in that god-awful match we saw on Dynamite with Butcher, Blade, Keith Lee, and Swerve Strickland this past week, where Swerve went for a leapfrog on the Blade, but Blade accidentally caught Swerve on the leapfrog attempt, and both guys completely ate shit. Wouldn't you know it, same thing happened here with poor Taker and Samu. These guys are at least talented enough where they were able to cover it up because they knew what they were doing. But, even just going back and watching the way Taker sold in his matches and the way he carried himself, once again, something that totally wouldn't work in the business today, as we clearly found out when Bray Wyatt was doing pretty much the same thing under the Fiend gimmick, and yeah, that got over like a fart in church. They had built the story of the match here around the fact that The Undertaker had his urn stolen, and therefore he was essentially powerless without Paul Bearer by his side. Paul Bearer, who I believe had recently been taken out by the massively untalented Mr. Hughes, which, God almighty, I guess we're going to have to talk about him at some point. Didn't last all that long, but he made an impact in his short tenure. But they build up to the big finish here where Samu was giving Taker a couple big moves. And Taker went to try and sit up, but he couldn't. So he collapsed. So Samu slaps him around a couple times to make sure he's actually dead. And he climbs up to the top rope for the big splash. And in one of the best camera shots of the night, as Samu comes crashing down on the mat while Taker sits up and he looks into the camera with that menacing face. And of course, it's all downhill from there. It's followed with the choke slam and the tombstone pile driver combo that we've all come to know and love. 5 stars. No, I'm just kidding. Definitely not the match I'd recommend people go out of their way to check out if they're looking for some classic Taker content, but still very fun. And again, nobody worked in the business like this around this point. It's just one of those things that worked for the time, wouldn't work in the latter periods of the wrestling business, but it really was. It was right place, right time. That's all you can describe with it. And personally, I'm glad I had the opportunity to review a Taker match on our first retro WWF review. We'll be seeing plenty more of him going forward, but anytime I get a chance to mark out for Taker, I'm going to jump on that bandwagon. So if you're not an Undertaker fan, you can probably just skip over these segments because most of them I'm going to be promoting positivity. So that was followed with something not so great. Not because the segment was particularly bad, it's just the sheer horrors that they were setting up that made my ass cheeks tense up. So it begins with Mr. Fuji and Yokozuna coming out to join Vince at ringside for a promo. By the way, Yoko sporting my favorite version of the WWF Championship here. Love that belt design. And, well, long story short, Fuji was saying something about Lex Luger cheating during the Body Slam challenge, and I really couldn't understand a lick of what he said. Between the rambunctious fans and Fuji's broken English, it was impossible to catch most of what he said. But the segment was about to get worse. Because who should come out to confront them but Crush? Oh, yes. Crush. What can you say about Crush, a.k.a. Bryan Adams, and his 738 incarnations that we would see over the years? He had the size, and that's about where the buck stops. In the ring, he was the absolute shits. On the stick, he was mid at best. Never really got over with the crowd. And, granted, he was saddled with some pretty bad gimmicks, but, once again, we just talked about this with Taker and how because this was the cartoon era of the wrestling business, this really was a sink or swim situation for a lot of the boys around this time. How talented enough were they to take character concepts that were pitched to them and make them work? Unfortunately, Crush wasn't skilled enough to really get any of them over. Especially not the goofy Hawaiian gimmick with the fake accent. My God, that was just putridly bad. I mean, they try to make this thing work here. The premise of the segment is that they're setting up Crush and Yoko for a title match next week, since Mr. Fuji put out an open contract for anyone that wants to try and beat the big guy. So Crush accepts, and they booked it for next week. So, yes, next week on the program, we are apparently going to be reviewing a Yokozuna versus Crush WWF Championship match. Brace yourselves. That one's going to hurt. And our main event is Mr. Perfect squashing Lou Costello. Or Brad Costello, whatever his name was. It wasn't Al Costello. The brain was convinced it was Bud Abbott's partner, but we all know that the original Lou Costello was a lot more talented than this jabroni. And with about a minute left of airtime, they rang the bell for this match. Kurt Hennig beat the man in approximately 55 seconds with the Perfect Plex, and it was immediately to the credits. A totally and completely pointless squash that also made me value Mr. Perfect that much more because of how truly remarkable that guy was as an in-ring talent. I mean, I could spend eons talking about every single person we saw on this program and going over their career highlights, but we got plenty of time to talk about Mr. Perfect in future episodes, so I won't go too in-depth with him right now. But that was our first retro review of WWF Raw. Very enjoyable show. Got to see my favorite wrestler in action. Got to hear a great commentary team back when the commentators were actually good at their jobs and had personalities. Got to see some actual star power. Plus, it was only 45 minutes instead of, fucking 3 hours. So, we'll pick back up next week with the follow-up edition where we try and torturously sit through a Yokozuna Crush singles match. Given time. Will it be as bad as I'm anticipating, having not seen the match in well over 20 years? More than likely. So that brings us to this episode of NWA Powerrr, which was quite the show. Still not entirely sure how I felt about that whole thing by the end, but it's usually par for the course with modern wrestling. It begins with a completely random, unannounced three-way match to determine the number one contender for the TV title. The match is Judas versus AJ Kazana, who I believe I've seen once or twice on the show doing jobs, versus Odinson, who is one half of a tag team. It's pretty equivalent to let's pull three random names out of a hat, and whoever we draw, those are the three guys wrestling. Or who knows, maybe Billy Corgan was walking in the back earlier before the taping and went, shit, we need another match to fill time on the show. Who is closest to where I'm standing at this given moment? You three, come here. You're wrestling tonight. But my attention was mostly on the official they assigned to ref this match. Who in the blue hell was that? Better yet, what in the blue hell was that? Could they have found any more of a generic-looking parking lot attendant than this guy? I mean, I'm not saying your official should look more intimidating than the wrestlers, but they should at least look like someone who could believably call a sporting event instead of someone that looks like they ought to be substitute teaching a math class at your local high school. Match was pretty bad, and that's putting it gently. And given the fact that it was only about 6 minutes in length, that should really tell you something. I really don't have a whole lot of input beyond that, if I'm being honest. It was a cold open to find someone else to feed to Tyrus for a future title match. Odinson won. Cool. And unfortunately, that was followed with a promo that was so horrendously bad. Instead of me talking about it, I'm just going to play the audio for this thing in its entirety because I'll let you be the judge of what you took away from this.
Allow me to introduce the NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, the man himself, the notorious legend, Homicide.
Oh, yeah. Orale. Can you say that one more time? One more time. The great NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion of the world.
The NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion of the world, the notorious legend, 187, Homicide. Was that good?
That was good. That was very good. But let me tell you something. As for business right now, I got to give a big shout out to the Morton family. Ricky Morton, he's the greatest of all time. Ricky Morton. You know Ricky Morton? You know Ricky Morton? Rock and roll? Rock and roll. Kerry Morton, he's a future legend. But he doesn't got the it factor. He doesn't. No. But I want to fight Kerry Morton at this big event coming up for the NWA. And I'm going to give this title shot to the man himself, Kerry Morton. Morton family, thank you for saving me because, you know, I need people to save my life. And Ricky and Kerry saved my life. So, put this title down. But, we got some guy named VSK.
I was going to bring that up. NWA USA, you'll be defending against VSK, a member of the Cardona family, and obviously you can't look past him. I mean, what if he wins the championship? Don't get mad, it's just a question.
You're a bad messenger. Anyway, NWA USA, I'm a fighting champion. I would have and defend this belt to anybody. Hey, you want this belt? You want this belt, homie? You want this belt? You cannot have this belt.
Well, you heard it right there. If Homicide is still champion at NWA 74, he wants to put the championship on the line against Kerry Morton. But I don't know the future. You have to tune in to find out.
He's drunk, right? Or at the very least, he's stoned out of his fucking gourd. Seriously, what the hell are they thinking letting this guy talk? This is like the third or fourth homicide promo I've heard him cut on this show where he is audibly slurring his speech and sounding like he took about 8 shots of whiskey before going out there. Just stop, NWA. Whoever is letting this guy go out and cut promos, just stop. It sounds horrible. Speaking of horrible and me not having a single clue what the fuck is going on, does anyone want to even try to explain the Aaron Stevens May Valentine deal? Talk about going unscripted. Do these two have any game plan going into this segment as to what they were going to talk about? Here's what I gathered about this whole thing, and verbatim, these are my notes about the sit down with Aaron and May. Something about their flight to Brazil being canceled, something about Aaron Stevens being good friends with Rodney Mack, something about Aaron Stevens wanting to travel to beaches in Brazil so they could fuck, while May wanted to introduce Aaron to her parents. By the way, they are a couple now, apparently. All of those bullet points I summed up in about 15 seconds. This promo went for about twice as long and was just one run-on after another. I felt like I was listening to a Dave Meltzer segment on Observer Radio, where every other word is and tongue-clicking. Horrible. And by the way, not to dwell on something that probably doesn't need that much attention, but what in the hell did this have to do with professional wrestling? Why would anyone give 2 flying fucks that Aaron and May are bonking one another? Am I the only one that apparently couldn't care less? Seriously, who comes up with these skits? So that was followed with a promo that was moderately decent in comparison to the rest of the promo material on this episode. We get May Valentine interviewing all members of the Cardona family. And the premise here is that they're all holding Billy Corgan to his word that he promised all 4 members of the group title shots at some point. That apparently will start with VSK receiving his junior heavyweight title match against Homicide on a future episode. By the way, this is the first promo I believe I've heard VSK cut in the NWA. Hopefully it's his last. And Mike Knox informed us that he does not have a cell phone, but Corgan can reach out to him via mailbox in order to let him know when his title shot will happen. And then he politely asked Billy to not have Knox need to remind him again. So, yeah. Heels threatening the boss and making demands for championship shots that are unwarranted. Beyond apparent word of mouth. I'm sure if this were Bill Watts in the early to mid-'80s, this would have gone over swimmingly with him. Having Hacksaw Butch Reed or Nature Boy Buddy Landell or Jimmy Cornette in the Midnights holding Watts' feet to the fire making demands for title shots? Oh, wait a second. Now that you mention it, that did happen with Corny and the Midnights. And you know what happened? Watts stuck it to the heels by slapping Cornette in the face and knocking him goofy. So hopefully Corgan at least has a spine and doesn't cave into the heels' commands. So then Trevor Murdoch had a squash match against a random job guy accompanied by Adrian Street's grandson. Trevor won with the top rope bulldog. And then we went to the podium immediately afterwards with Kyle Davis. Trevor was there too, figuring he was going to cut a quick promo, but Kyle was there to bring out the Pope, who wanted to personally congratulate Trevor on becoming the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion for a second time. And Pope came out to, as I directly wrote down here, Pope came out to pimp. Not in the literal sense, but he was indeed pimping during his little speech here. But here's the twist. He goes for the handshake to Trevor, but Trevor walks away. So the plot thickens with the Pope and Trevor drama. Actually, if you think about it, based on the way they were building this up on the show, they were already kind of going in the direction of teasing the Trevor heel turn right before he won the belt. And that was also right around the point where Pope was trying to give Trevor all those inspirational speeches and whatnot. So if they're still toiling with the idea of keeping this feud going, I'm on board with it. If anything, because it'll mean we get to hear Pope cut more promos. And I could always go to hear Pope cut more promos. Then we had an Allison Kay promo, which quickly segued into something else entirely. But first, she talked about her and Marty Bell losing the women's tag titles, which they are devastated about. Yeah, I'll bet. But then she quickly turns the subject to Camille, who she claims to have unfinished business with, dating back to, I believe she said, 2020. So they apparently held off a storyline between Camille and Allison Kay for 2 years and have not acknowledged anything about it until now. But she's trying to set up a program with her. In walks Kylan King to say that she also has unfinished business with Camille, and she wants Allison in a match next week to determine the true number one contender for the singles belt. And they did some wacky comedy here at the end where both girls were verbally jousting back and forth, and May was trying to pass the mic back and forth between the two. That was pretty dumb. But, I've put over what a great job Kylan's been doing with her push lately, and while I wouldn't say I've been blown away with Allison's work in the NWA thus far, we'll see how the match goes. Both girls at least look like legit athletes, so they got that going. So then we had our main event match. My first ever experience seeing Ricky Morton's son, Kerry, in action. And he's wrestling Jay Bradley here. A lot of Kerry's training has been undertaken by Ricky. So with whatever matches Kerry's been working, most of it's been happening on the NWA USA show. But I like what they did to set this up. Take note, AEW. You might learn a thing or two about how to properly catch people up to speed when they haven't been watching some of your particular programs. The announcers sell us on the story with the Mortons and the Fixers. They showed some highlight packages of the teams wrestling against each other, and they talked up the issues, and they got people on board with what was going on heading into the match instead of just assuming that everybody already knew going in. Guaranteed Ricky had a thing or two with influencing this promo package. I guarantee you that. So, well, here's what I'll say about Kerry Morton. And again, keep in mind, this is after one viewing experience of seeing him wrestle. He's obviously very green, but he's got a lot of the Ricky Morton mannerisms under his belt, which is a good thing. He's a great underdog babyface. He's a pretty good seller. He got the people back behind him for the entirety of the match. And really, this was about as old school wrestling can get. You got the valiant, scrappy underdog babyface who takes the beating for about 95% of the match. You got the big, strong heel that just pounds and dominates the ring action. And then you get the big upset win at the end where Bradley gets distracted with Ricky Morton trash talking on the outside. So Kerry runs up from behind, rolls him up for the flash pin, and it gets a big pop from the studio crowd. This worked. The match wasn't anything to write home about, but as far as effectively getting over a fresh face and trying to establish a new name, this was one of the most effective things I've seen on a pro wrestling show in Lord knows how long. Actually getting someone over the right way. I love what they did in this segment. Because even though the match wasn't particularly great, this is where all the moves marks out there can go pound sand. Because at the end of the day, moves don't mean jack shit. And I know people aren't going to like hearing that, especially some of the younglings that are watching the business today. You want to talk about how to actually get over a young kid the right way? This is how you fucking do it. So, thank God Ricky Morton had his hands in the cookie jar with this, because any input he's providing for Kerry segments are going to make the segments much better going forward. Now, we just need to hear him cut some promos and see if he's got that Ricky Morton spunk on the stick. So hopefully that's something Ricky's training him on too, because it is going to be extremely crucial if they want to push this kid and make a big deal out of him. He's got some big shoes to fill if they're going to try and make him this next generation's Ricky Morton. So we'll see where his progress is in about 6 months to a year, and we'll probably have a better foundation on his potential. My hope is he doesn't end up becoming this generation's Eric Watts, because that would be a pretty big tragedy. It's always dicey when you're talking about second or third generation talent in the business, especially when the first generation guys were big stars to begin with. WWE's lucky to have stumbled into Braun Rex Steiner, who's absolutely going to be a big star for them. On the other channel, you got Austin and Colton Gunn, who they have a lot of potential because of being in close proximity with their dad in terms of training and understanding the business. So, Kerry's in good hands right now. I'm cautiously optimistic to see where he goes in the future. And then we closed with a pretty interesting little announcement from William Patrick Corgan, which began with a great little comedic relief where Kyle Davis completely forgot that Corgan was advertised to make an announcement, yet the first thing Kyle says when Corgan comes out to the booth was, "I wasn't expecting you." And Corgan made fun of him for this. Whoops. I think I've already kind of touched on Corgan in a speaking role on this program. It's certainly not Tony Khan level awkward, but he's not Bill Watts or Fritz Von Erich or Vince McMahon. Let's just call it like we see it. There's not a whole lot of bass or oomph in his promo delivery. And granted, I know he's a musician and he's got that higher range in terms of like a tonal center, but still not really conducive to what an authority figure should sound like, especially if he's going to be cutting promos. That's all I'm saying. But he basically tells us that he's hosting a tournament to crown the number one contender for the 10 pounds of gold at the NWA 74 event, because they got a lot of number one contenders in place right now, so I guess the tournament route is the best way to go. The Race for the Chase tournament, which I've now determined is one notch above the Fight for the Right tournament, coined from TNA as the worst name for a tournament in wrestling history. And, well, it's strange because he announced 6 of the participants in the tournament, and the opening rounds were going to be getting the Pope versus Brian Myers, Tom Latimer versus Chris Adonis, and Nick Aldis versus Tim Storm, which I'll touch more on in a second. And he didn't announce another set of brackets beyond that. So if it turns out that this becomes a 6-person tournament, that probably means someone's going to get a bye to the finals. So we'll see if he expands on that or if it just ends up being those 6 guys. But the Tim Storm announcement was pretty interesting because Billy touched on the stipulation from the Aldis Storm title match from a few years ago, where if Storm lost that match, he vowed he would never challenge for the world title again. And I actually vividly remember watching that match because I believe that was shortly after the NWA relaunch when the company was pretty hot. And of course, Tim lost that match, which prevented him from challenging for the belt at any point in the future. But it was apparently because of Trevor Murdoch, who went to Billy and asked for the clause to be lifted. Why, I'm not exactly sure. He didn't really explain it well. But Tim's going to get another opportunity to challenge for the world title again. And I like that little promo he cut at the booth before the close of the show. Basically talking about the meaning and the prestige of being the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion and how much this opportunity means to him. So, judging how this whole thing went down, I mean, Tim Storm's got to win the tournament, right? Why else would you lift a stipulation like that after almost 3 years if you weren't going to go all the way with it? Do I expect Storm to beat Trevor for the belt? Honestly, I don't see it as completely implausible. at the very least, I'd probably figure it would be more centered around a retirement match kind of deal where it would sort of be Tim's last swan song before he calls it quits. Because the guy's only sporadically working anymore, and he's pushing 60 now. He's probably only got a handful of matches left in him anyway, and if he's looking to sort of phase out as an in-ring worker, I couldn't think of a better way to go out than to have him and Trevor wrestle for the world title at one of their more highly anticipated events. They'll probably have a sizable crowd for that show too, so there'd be an audience for it. Yeah. The Tim Storm thing kind of throws a wrench into the mix, I guess. Because it really kind of seemed they were either going the direction of Nick Aldis and Trevor or the Pope and Trevor, but, now you got Tim floating in the possibilities as well, so I'm really interested to see where they go with this. I've always appreciated Tim Storm's work, and he's about as real and authentic of a babyface as you can get in today's business. If MJF is the most extreme of the heels, then Tim Storm's on the polar opposite extreme as a babyface. Oh, God. Yeah, now that I think about it, the dream matches we'll never get to see, but can you fucking imagine that match? MJF versus Tim Storm? What an old-school Southern-style match that would be. I'd pay to see that match with about 6 months build-up for the promos alone. Anyway, that was one of the strangest episodes of Power I can recall in recent memory. It started off in the doldrums, and by the end, it ended up working its way to being a moderately decent wrestling program. If I just watched the last 15 minutes, I probably would have been better off, but my God. Starting with that three-way opener and working its way up until pretty much the Kerry Morton match, there were points I was sitting there going, am I watching NWA Powerrr or TNA Wrestling? Just one bad segment after another. Like I said, it ended up turning itself around by the end, but the whole first half hour was just garbage. There's just no other blunt way to put it. It was just bad. Worse than some of the stuff I saw on Dynamite this past week. I mean, if the latter half of the show was booked by Corgan and someone with a clue, the first half was booked by Vince Russo. Oh, God, I don't even want to think about that being a possibility. No, trust me, I would know if Russo was booking this show because I'm pretty sure most of the women would be calling each other skanks and whores the entire time. Anyway, hopefully this revamp/reboot of the Monday podcast works going forward. I certainly had fun watching that episode of WWF Raw, and while there will probably be some bad TV moments in future episodes, at least it'll be something worth discussing in detail instead of just sauntering through the same old song and dance with AEW Rampage. So if you enjoyed the show, make sure to give it a like. Please subscribe and click the bell icon to stay notified of when our posts go up. That is Mondays and Fridays for any new viewers. And we'll be back this coming Friday for the regular podcast, covering AEW Dynamite, NWA World Championship Wrestling, and World Class Championship Wrestling. Take care, all. Peace out.